Did you know? Juggernaut was reprinted in Darksteel. Before then, Juggernaut had not seen a reprint since Revised in 1994. Darksteel released in 2004, making the iconic artifact creature absent for 10 years. So why did it take so long? During Magic's early days, Juggernaut was one of the best creatures in the game. In fact, Juggernaut was perceived to be so good that it was banned and extended for a time. When the reserved list was instituted in 1996, Juggernaut was one of the unfortunate victims. However, the reserved list was revised in 2002, and the famous artifact creature could be reprinted again. When Juggernaut returned in Darksteel, it did not see the same success in Standard as it did years ago. This was due to the format having lots of artifact hate and faster creatures. Another card that had not seen a reprint in a while was Fireball. Before Darksteel, Fireball saw its last reprint in 1997 when 5th edition was released. Unlike Juggernaut, Fireball did see play in Standard. The classic red spell was played in Tooth and Nail decks splashing red. It also had new artwork by Dave Dorman. This depiction of Fireball was used in several later versions of the card, such as Magic Core Sets 2010 to 2012, and the more recent Iconic Masters. Indestructible was introduced in Darksteel. This keyword mechanic was well received and is now evergreen. For the viewers who do not know what evergreen means, it's a term for a keyword ability that can be used in any new set. One of the most popular Indestructible cards was Darksteel Colossus. This giant 11/11 for 11 was played as a summoning target in Tooth and Nail decks. Another target was Sundering Titan. This 7/10 8-drop was great at slowing the opponent down because it destroys a land of each basic land type when it enters the battlefield. Speaking of Tooth and Nail, Reap and Sow was an efficient spell in the deck. For its regular cost, Reap and Sow could either destroy a land or have any land card from the library enter play untapped. The spell also had Entwine, which does both effects if the player paid an additional cost. Ramping into its namesake was the primary strategy for Tooth and Nail, so Reap and Sow was a great addition. Deathcloud was a fan favorite among mono-black control players. It had the makings of a return to old Pox decks, a strategy that decimated the opponent by removing a third of their resources. Unfortunately, Deathcloud never took off in Standard like it did in Extended. The reason why was the deck didn't have the support it needed until later sets released. Mostly paired with green for mana acceleration and creatures with recursion effect, Deathcloud would build up on resources to then cast its namesake. This would decimate both players' resources on board and in hand. However, the Deathcloud player always ended up ahead. It also played Garruk Wildspeaker. Deathcloud does not require players to sacrifice planeswalkers. Garruk, with its loyalty abilities of untapping lands or playing a token creature, was a great way to recover post-Deathcloud. Memnarch, the antagonist of the Mirrodin story, received its official card in Darksteel. This legendary artifact creature did not see much play when it was legal in Standard. However, in Commander, it's an all-star. Whether as a general or a follower, Memnarch is a potent weapon, especially with two other cards from Darksteel, Mycosynth Lattice and Darksteel Forge. With those two artifacts and Memnarch in play, the player could start controlling every permanent while keeping the artifacts they control indestructible. For Mirrodin, the Affinity mechanic only had affinity for artifacts. However, in Darksteel, affinity for lands was included. It was featured on a cycle of common artifact golems that had affinity for each basic land type. These creatures were great in Draft and even saw appearances in Pauper. Speaking of affinity, it was already an established archetype in Standard, but when Arcbound Ravager was printed, it became an unstoppable force. With modular and the ability to gain +1/+1 counter when you sacrifice an artifact you control, Ravager replaced Atog as the deck's finisher. This switch completely changed Affinity, and it quickly became the best deck in Standard. Affinity with Ravager was so powerful that towards the end of the Mirrodin cycle, Arcbound Ravager, along with 7 other cards that were also staples in Affinity, were banned. It was one of the largest bannings in Magic's history. The game had not seen a solid land card that animated into an artifact creature since Mishra's Factory was reprinted in 4th edition. So, when Blinkmoth Nexus was printed, it caught the eyes of many players. This land was a 4-of in Affinity because Modular could transfer the +1/+1 counters to Blinkmoth Nexus when animated. The counters would remain on the land and count toward the land's power and toughness when it transforms into a creature again. Blinkmoth Nexus also had flying, making it one of the deadliest finishers in Affinity. One of the best artifacts ever printed was Skull Clamp. When the equipment was revealed, it became one of the most anticipated cards in the set. It exceeded everyone's expectations. However, its dominance did not last long. When the next set, 5th Dawn, released, it was no surprise Skull Clamp received the ban hammer. The equipment was practically played in every deck. It didn't matter if they were aggro, mid-range, or control. If it had creatures, the deck vastly improved with Skull Clamp. In fact, Skull Clamp was so dominant that almost every deck that topped a tournament had 4 copies. Affinity was perhaps the best deck to utilize the broken equipment, but Goblins, and Elf, and Nail were equally as good. Today, Skull Clamp is only legal in Vintage and Commander. Another incredibly powerful artifact card printed in Darksteel is Aether Vial. At Pro Tour Columbus in 2004, Aether Vial was a 4-of in the Affinity deck that took down the tournament. The reason why it was so effective in Affinity was it increased the artifact count while being able to play creatures at instant speed. After Mirrodin block rotated out of Standard, Aether Vial continued seeing play in other formats such as Extended, Legacy, and Modern. Decks that use Aether Vial primarily focus on creatures with a low curve, the most common being Death and Taxes and Merfolk. A creature that saw play, but mostly in control decks as a finisher, was Pristine Angel. In Scars of Mirrodin, Pristine Angel returned as a cameo on the card Grasp of Darkness. If you look closely, you can see the Pristine Angel being consumed by some dark material. This depiction makes sense with the game's mechanics, since Pristine Angel is a 4/4 and Grasp of Darkness gives target creature -4/-4 until end of turn. A lot of cards from Mirrodin block changed the Vintage format, but Trinisphere was perhaps the most impactful. Because of Mishra's Workshop, a land that produces 3 colorless mana that can only be used to cast artifact spells. Trinisphere was the de facto artifact to cast on turn 1. From there, all spells that cost 2 or less now cost 3. Trinisphere was an obvious 4-of in Workshop decks until it was restricted in Vintage a year after Darksteel released. Darksteel introduced the beloved Sword Cycle. For the uninitiated, the Sword Cycle is a set of 5 equipment cards that granted protection of 2 enemy colors. Darksteel released the first pair with Sword of Fire and Ice and Sword of Light and Shadow. Several years later, Scars of Mirrodin block finished the set. Besides granting the equipped creature protection, the equipment also boosted the power and toughness by 2, and when that creature deals combat damage to an opponent, 2 trigger effects would occur. For Fire and Ice, it was 2 damage to any target and draw a card. Light and Shadow was gain 3 life and return up to 1 target creature from the graveyard to hand. Both swords were very good and still see play in almost every format they're legal in. That's all we have on Darksteel. As you can see, both Mirrodin and Darksteel had a lot of powerful cards that changed the game. Fortunately, it doesn't stop there, and we still have the final set to cover, 5th Dawn. This has been DJ from the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel voicing this episode. You can see me on my own YouTube channels where I talk about Commander stuff. You can also find me co-hosting with Josh Lee Kwai on the Command Zone. If you want to talk to me about Magic, follow me at Jumbo Commander on Twitter. This episode was produced by CoolStuffInc.com. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.